And in addition, right, we've seen mental health related issues increase. This is at the college where I worked for 30 years, increase 140% over the decade. And we've seen, and again, we have followed the lead of American institutions. And you're always a bit ahead of us in terms of the human service and the student service sort of part of schooling and post-secondary. We really look to the United States as being leaders in this area. But we've been at it probably for the last decade. 2010 to 2020 is sort of where we're now starting to pay attention to the fact that students are coming to school and having difficulty focusing, having difficulty doing work because of the need for us to accommodate disabilities, to accommodate special circumstances. And mental health has quickly become number two. Learning disabilities is still number one in terms of post-secondary. But we've, again, borrowed from the Americans, and we've instituted the National College Health Assessment, which is an American tool. And if you've gone to a college university in the States, you're probably familiar with this, because thousands of US schools use this tool. It's a broad tool. Just Google NCHA 2019, and you'll find the national results. It looks at everything from how much you exercise to how much green stuff you eat to whether you have your immunizations. It asks questions related to mental health, whether you, all sorts of things. It really takes a measure of wellness. It takes probably about 20 to 30 minutes to complete the online survey. And we've been doing it in Canada now for a number of years. I was brought back to Confederation College to do it last year. We had a 22% response rate, which is good. And anyway, this is some of the stuff we found out. So you're going to ask me, what are the things that coaches can do in terms of preparing for the mental health needs of students in the age of COVID? And one of the things I would say is that we need to concern ourselves with this concept of mental health literacy. We need to learn about mental health and what it means. Now, I'm assuming that if you're a phys ed person, you also teach health, and I would imagine that wellness is a big part of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you'll notice that this is what our students told us over 3 times that we've done the NCHA, 14, 16, and 19, about diagnosed mental disorders. So we distinguish, mental health literacy tells us, there are mental health disorders where we have enough symptoms, at a severity and a duration and a frequency, which means that we can be diagnosed with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, the DSM, which is the Bible for psychiatrists and psychologists. So these are people that have been diagnosed and are being treated. So these are the ones that are at the top of the pyramid. These are the folks that have actually have become diagnosed. And you see anxiety is sort of the winner in terms of we have a pretty anxious group. And this is primarily, these are Gen Zs. So one in 5 are evidencing sort of a diagnosis. And I don't think it's much different in the United States. Panic attacks, 12%. Depression, 16.4% of the population. But an interesting statistic is that if you take a look over students reporting on the right side, none. So we've gone to 68% of the students report none, which means 32% of the students have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder. Okay, so I tell teachers 1 in 3. And I think that, again, that's not even addressing the students that have mental health issues. So when we talk about mental health issues, those are kids that have symptoms, but haven't gotten help or have not been diagnosed or do not have the symptoms at a severity, duration, or frequency to justify a diagnosis. But you take a look at some of the ones that are pervasive, felt very lonely, 62% in the last year. Very, very sad, 67.5%. Felt so depressed in the last year that it was difficult to function, almost half.
Wow.
Now, these are statistics that blow people on their butts. They're surprised. And we're not surprised anymore. And these numbers are going up. They're still going up.
Yeah.
You can imagine what's going to happen now in the age of COVID. We're going to see increased and more, pervasive mental health, not only disorders, but issues. And suicide is upticking. After many years where we had done work in the United States and Canada to lower suicide rates, they're ticking up and have over the last 5 years. So, and have you heard of Jean Twenge, the psychologist? Have you seen this book called iGen?
I've seen that, yeah. Yeah.
It's a super book, really good book. She's a psychologist. She's in California, and she wrote 2 pieces in 2017. One piece she wrote was in Atlantic Magazine, and I think it's in the reference list I sent you. And the book was, the article was entitled, that's very, very dramatic. It sort of said, "Has the iPhone destroyed a generation?"
Wow.
It got a lot of attention. And this was taken from that article, where she sort of says that there are a lot of indicators that she sort of takes from longitudinal research. And she quotes about 4 different longitudinal studies that have been done in the US, some from back in the 1960s, asking the same questions to different generations so that you can do comparative analysis. And what she found was there were a number of indices that just, the trend lines went crazy after 2007.
Yeah.
The introduction of the iPhone. This one, people saying more likely to be lonely. We're looking at, when we take a look, often felt left out, often felt lonely, moving up into the mid and low 30%, really, really high. And this was taken from her book that I just showed you. This is asking grade 12s about their self-esteem, and took a look at self-competence and self-liking, how confident they are in their abilities and how much they sort of like themselves in terms of, and they're precipitous in terms of going down. So what we're seeing is, again, and we've seen this over, and this corresponds with the iGens sort of growing up.
Wow.
So after the COVID hit, and we've been looking at this, we say that more than a quarter of the United States right now have the symptoms which would render them capable of being diagnosed with clinical depression. So moderate and severe clinical depression. That's more than one in 4. And normally when we do this in terms of the United States, we're looking at 8%. Mm-hmm. And this is huge. Like, this number is enormous. And this has happened over periods of months, like over a period of weeks, not years. So I don't think we've seen anything like this. In Canada, very similar. A study that was done recently just shows, in terms of Canadians who felt depressed, this is a little more detailed. You'll see that when we talk about depression, the numbers are fairly similar, 18 to 39-year-olds. So those measure Gen Zs and millennials. And then 40 to 59-year-olds, we're taking a look at Xers. And the youngest boomers. And then the people who are 60 plus have the lowest rates of depression. That's probably because they're the best settled financially. They're probably, again, this impact of finances. Again, if you take a look at, they're much more likely to be depressed. And this has measured depression over 3 different time periods. So there's a trend line down as people sort of getting used to the pandemic. There's also higher rates of depression for people that have kids, very understandable. And what's really interesting is that females are diagnosed with depression more often than males are. But take a look at how the trends, again, it's not as different as it used to be. And again, I think more males are starting to actually acknowledge that they're not doing well and getting help. And just one more tick, though, anxiety is going to be the big one, not so much fear. And that has to do with brain science that we're going to talk about in a minute.
Okay.
You take a look, corresponds roughly with the percentage of people in the United States who are experiencing depression. And I couldn't find a real quick and easy, dirty stat for anxiety, but I would guess in the United States it's higher, and affecting our youth more than people who are older. More likely, again, if you're dealing with female athletes, more likely to be anxious or depressed or have been diagnosed for that. And for parents out there, yes, kids mean that parents are going to be more anxious than if you don't have kids.
Well, do you think it's a little bit of a ripple effect, Dan? I mean, because we've been stuck in the house together for how many months now, right? And obviously you see
Absolutely.
parents being anxious about certain situations and stressed and
Yeah.
all of this, and children are sponges, right? They soak up.
Absolutely.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and your brain on COVID. So I guess we started off sort of saying that, generally speaking, the generation that we're going to be coaching, that we're going to be teaching, etc., already have shown that we have higher levels of mental health issues, mental health disorders. Some of that's really good, right? We've trained people to get help. Younger people are much more likely to understand what depression is, what anxiety is. They know that it is an entity that you can be diagnosed with. Like when I was younger, way back then, like we didn't have that awareness, right? There was one person down the street who we thought was crazy. Like we didn't quite understand what mental health was,
And
right?
there's
We didn't
stigma
talk about it.
and there
Right?
was a stigma, more of a stigma to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's less stigma, and that's good. But the brain on COVID, and I like this, again, I've stolen this diagram right from the article that I'm quoting. It's a woman named Carolyn Abraham who just published this piece last month in a Canadian magazine called Walrus, which is another one of my favorites. Think of the brain as a story house. And if you've ever heard of triune brain theory, it was very popular in the 1970s. And I know I don't think you were born in the 70s, but triune brain theory says that there's three discernible sort of parts of the brain that have evolved with time. So the first part of, and the best way to think of it is really cool, is that she suggests that you think the metaphor is a house. Foundation of the house is reptilian brain, and that's the most basic, most ancient part of our brain, which sort of deals with things like, breathing and, like respiration and heartbeat and all that kind of stuff. It keeps us going. It keeps us alive, and it's the most basic part of the brain. It's responsible for, et cetera. Then there's, as we became sort of more evolved, there's the next floor that is built upon is the limbic part of our brain. And the limbic part of our brain, deals with things like memory, and it deals with stuff like, blood pressure. But for our purposes, the part of the limbic brain that's the most important is the amygdala. And it's this almond-shaped part of our brain that keeps us safe and that is ultra sensitive to danger. And it's the part of the brain that tells the lizard part of the brain, it sort of pokes it with a stick and said, hey, we're going to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. We got to either fight this thing or fly. We got to leave. And then on top of those two stories is the executive branch. Oh, I shouldn't say that. The executive part of our brain. And the executive part of our brain is the magical part of our brain that allows us to think and to process and to imagine. And boy, are we good at imagining. We're good at imagining all sorts of danger. And as I did last night by reading that article, I read an article last night on how badly the United States has essentially been defeated by the coronavirus. And it talked about that this coronavirus there are going to be others that come our way that are going to be worse. And I just started to imagine the fear. And before I went to sleep, my amygdala reacted. And I woke up in the morning with my stomach churning with gastric acid. And I felt like I had stomach reflux because my mind had worked all night and dreamed about the fact we're going to have to deal with this again. So the reptilian part of the brain and the limbic part of the brain, right, are notorious overreactors. We really haven't been able to sort of train our limbic system because it's mainly unconscious. We don't really think about it. And there's evidence, by the way, that the amygdala will react to a snake in the grass before we're even conscious of it. It's ultra sensitive, but it doesn't distinguish between getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger and potentially failing in a track meet that's going to happen tomorrow afternoon. My body reacts to those things similarly, right? And the other thing which is cool is that a recent research in London, England, found that the amygdala works better, more efficiently when it sees the threat, when it's a visual threat. So if it's a team that you're dealing with and you're scared because you think you're going to be overwhelmed, the amygdala deals with that much better, and it pumps the adrenaline and the cortisol and gets our body going, and we're able to, do things that we didn't think we could do. When the threats are unseen, the amygdala doesn't do as well. And seen threats cause fear, and the amygdala works well with fear, but with ongoing anxiety because of unseen threats, the amygdala doesn't work so good. And what happens is our reaction time's not as good. What they did to find this out is they had video games, and they had kids playing video games. And when you dealt with a monster that you could see on the screen, you did much better in reaction time. But when the things that were going to hurt you were snakes under rocks and you couldn't see where they were, the reaction time wasn't as good. And so what we're dealing with right now is this huge unseen threat of COVID. We don't know where it's coming from. It's unseen. It's 1,000th the size of a dust mite.